Tokyo's skies once belonged to the Empire of Japan. For years, their Zero fighters carved through the clouds with unmatched agility, striking fear into anyone who dared challenge them. But by 1944, the hunters became the hunted. Japanese pilots climbing into their cockpits whispered a single name with dread: the Mustang. The American P-51 wasn't just another fighter. It was a predator built for speed, distance, and destruction. Escorting B-29 bombers across the vast Pacific, these sleek machines suddenly appeared over Tokyo, miles beyond what the Japanese thought possible. Pilots who once believed they owned the air now faced a nightmare: relentless escorts that never ran out of fuel, never broke formation, and struck with deadly precision. For the men of Japan's Air Force, the Mustang was more than an opponent. It was an omen, a flying shadow that meant survival was no longer guaranteed. By the spring of 1944, the skies above Tokyo were no longer a sanctuary. The Japanese Empire had once relied on its skilled pilots and the legendary Zero fighter to dominate the air. But as the war dragged on, Japan faced a new and terrifying reality: America's P-51 Mustang had arrived. This aircraft was not just another addition to the U.S. arsenal, it was a revolution in air combat. With unmatched speed, incredible range, and devastating firepower, the Mustang became the perfect guardian for the massive B-29 bombers striking at the heart of Japan. For Japanese pilots, who had once counted on their home skies and familiar terrain for protection, the shock was immediate. Missions that had once been dangerous became almost suicidal. The arrival of the Mustang shifted the balance of power. Suddenly, Japan's proud airmen were forced into battles they could not win. The psychological weight was crushing. Every takeoff meant facing an invisible enemy waiting beyond the horizon. In this video, we'll uncover how the P-51 Mustang transformed the air war over Tokyo. Why Japanese pilots feared it so deeply, and how this single aircraft changed the course of history forever. Before the P-51 Mustang ever appeared in the skies above Tokyo, the Japanese believed their dominance in the air was nearly unshakable. At the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941, Japan's Zero fighter had stunned the world. It was light, agile, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. American and Allied aircraft initially struggled to match its maneuverability, and Japanese airmen gained a reputation for both skill and ferocity. In the early months, Japan's pilots seemed unstoppable, carving paths of destruction from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Singapore to the Dutch East Indies. But Japan's success carried within it the seeds of eventual weakness. The victories of 1941 and 1942 had cost precious resources, and the Japanese war machine could not replace them as quickly as the Americans could. Each Zero pilot lost was not just a casualty, it was the loss of years of training, of hard-earned combat experience that could not be easily passed on to rookies. By 1943, the tide of the air war was beginning to shift. American industry surged with astonishing speed. New planes rolled off production lines in quantities Japan could not dream of matching. More importantly, new tactics were being tested. Early in the war, Allied pilots had learned the hard way that dogfighting with the Zero on its terms, slow, twisting battles in the clouds, often ended in disaster. Instead, American pilots began to exploit weaknesses in the Japanese design: its fragile frame, lack of armor, and limited firepower. By refusing to turn with the Zero and instead using high-speed dives and boom and zoom attacks, Allied flyers began to reclaim the initiative. For Japan, the struggle became more desperate. Their famed aces still struck fear into enemies, but they were stretched thinner and thinner across vast fronts. The brutal campaigns in the Solomon Islands and over New Guinea bled away entire squadrons. By the time B-29 bombers began their raids against Japan's home islands, the air defense network was already fraying. Tokyo's defenders in 1944 understood the gravity of their situation. They had grown used to intercepting incoming bombers with desperate energy, knowing that stopping America's heavy raids was essential for national survival. But even then, they fought with one faint glimmer of hope: the belief that the long distance from American bases would always work in their favor. The Zero and other fighters might be outclassed in some respects, but at least Japan's home skies were close to their bases. They could strike, retreat, refuel, and strike again. This assumption would prove fatal. Because when the Mustang arrived, it shattered the one advantage Japanese pilots still believed they had. No longer could they count on the vast Pacific to drain America's strength. No longer could they believe that bombers would come alone, vulnerable to ambush. The age of the unescorted bomber was over, and the age of the long-range escort fighter had begun. The P-51 Mustang story began not in the skies over Tokyo, but in a desperate request from Britain in 1940. The Royal Air Force, battered by the Luftwaffe and stretched thin after the fall of France, needed new fighters, fast. They turned to North American aviation with a challenge: design and build a fighter aircraft in record time. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the war. Within just 120 days, the prototype for the Mustang was ready. At first, the aircraft was fitted with an Allison engine, which limited its performance at high altitude. While it proved effective at low levels, the Allies needed something more: a fighter capable of climbing high and escorting bombers over long distances. The turning point came when engineers tested the airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the Mustang was transformed. Climb higher, and travel farther than almost anything else in the skies. The U.S. Army Air Forces quickly recognized the potential. Here was the fighter they had been waiting for: sleek, powerful, and versatile. With its drop tanks, the Mustang had extraordinary range, enough to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep inside enemy territory and back. No longer would bombers be left to fend for themselves once they crossed into hostile airspace. With the P-51 at their side, they could strike anywhere, anytime. For the Americans, the timing could not have been better. In Europe, daylight bombing campaigns over Germany had been costly. Without adequate escorts, formations of B-17s and B-24s had been mauled by swarms of German fighters. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. Suddenly, the hunters of the Luftwaffe found themselves hunted. Losses mounted for the Germans, and American bombers could finally press their offensive deep into the Reich with devastating results. But while the Mustang made its reputation in Europe, it was in the Pacific that its long reach would become truly terrifying. The distances in this theater were vast. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles of open ocean separated the bases of the Allies from the heart of Japan. Japanese strategists believed this worked in their favor. They assumed no fighter could possibly escort bombers all the way from the Mariana Islands to Tokyo and still return. They were wrong. When the Mustang entered service in the Pacific, it shattered that illusion. With its endurance and speed, it could rise from distant island airfields, link up with squadrons of B-29 superfortresses, and stay with them for the entire journey. The Japanese Air Force, already strained from years of attrition, now faced a nightmare: they could no longer wait for bombers to appear alone. Every raid brought with it a vanguard of deadly escorts, ready to swoop down on any interceptor that dared approach. The Mustang was not just a new plane. It was a weapon designed to break the enemy's will. For Japanese pilots who had once believed their skies were untouchable, its arrival signaled the beginning of an entirely new kind of war. When the first waves of B-29 superfortresses rose from the Marianas in 1944, Japan's pilots braced for what they believed would be familiar duels. They had spent years training to intercept heavy bombers, diving through formations and trusting that sheer courage and numbers could punch through the American defenses. But this time, something was different. At first, the Japanese spotters reported the distant specks of bombers approaching Tokyo. Squadrons scrambled to meet them, climbing into their cockpits with a mix of dread and determination. Yet as they rose higher, scanning the sky for their targets, they saw unfamiliar silhouettes glinting in the sunlight. These were not bombers. They were fast, sleek, and perfectly positioned above and beside the incoming formations. The Mustangs had arrived. The first encounters were shocking. Japanese pilots accustomed to dueling slower, less agile escorts suddenly found themselves face to face with a predator unlike anything they had seen. The P-51s dived from high altitudes with blistering speed, their 6.50 caliber machine guns spitting fire with devastating accuracy. Entire flights of Japanese interceptors were torn apart before they could even line up their attacks on the bombers. One veteran recalled the first time he saw Mustangs sweeping in front of his squadron. They came from nowhere, like arrows out of the sun. You never saw them until they were already behind you. And once they were there, you had no escape. The Mustang's speed and range meant that American pilots could dictate the terms of battle. Japanese fighters, many of them older Zeros or hastily produced replacements, were no match. Attempts to climb high enough to engage the bombers were often cut short by Mustangs dropping out of the sky in coordinated attacks. Pilots who tried to dive away discovered that the P-51 could follow them even in steep, high-speed descents. Dogfighting, once the proud strength of Japan's airmen, had become a deadly trap. In the skies over Tokyo, entire units were decimated within minutes. Missions that had once carried a fighting chance turned into one-sided massacres. For the first time, Japanese pilots began to question whether their duty in the air was simply a march toward certain death. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. Many young pilots, barely trained and rushed into combat, panicked at the sight of the Mustang. Some turned back before reaching the bombers, unwilling to face the escorts. Others fought desperately, only to watch their comrades fall in flames. Veteran survivors understood the truth: the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. For the Americans, the Mustang became a symbol of invincibility. Escorting their bomber streams across the Pacific, they gained a reputation as the silent guardians of the B-29s. While the bombers rained destruction on Tokyo's factories and neighborhoods, the Mustangs cleared the skies, ensuring that Japanese defenders could not mount an organized resistance. Every successful mission deepened the terror. Tokyo's skies, once a place of pride and honor for Japanese aviators, became a realm of shadows and fear. With every encounter, the myth of Japanese air superiority crumbled further. Pilots who survived returned to their bases shaken, describing a new kind of enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once, an enemy that turned the very act of flight into a gamble with death. The first encounters with the Mustang were more than military defeats. They were psychological earthquakes that rippled through the ranks of Japan's air defense. For the men who took off each morning, the realization dawned with terrifying clarity: the war in the skies was no longer theirs to win. The arrival of the Mustang over Tokyo did more than change the outcome of individual battles, it altered the very psychology of Japanese air defense. Before the P-51, Japanese pilots had always fought with at least some sense of balance. They knew the odds were difficult, but they also trusted in their skills, the agility of their planes, and the advantage of defending their own skies. The Mustang erased all of that. For the first time, Japanese aviators entered combat already convinced of defeat. The long-range escort missions meant that every B-29 raid brought with it an unseen swarm of fighters, capable of appearing at any altitude, at any moment. The mere possibility of a Mustang lurking above the clouds was enough to make entire squadrons hesitate. It wasn't just the machine itself, it was the terror of the unknown. Veteran pilots began to notice the change in behavior among younger recruits. In the early years of the war, new pilots had rushed headlong into combat, inspired by the exploits of Japan's aces. Now, many of them froze at the first sign of trouble. Some deliberately hung back, circling outside the fight, while others broke formation altogether. For commanders, it became painfully clear that the fear of the Mustang was corroding discipline. Even among experienced airmen, morale deteriorated rapidly. They had trained to face enemy bombers, but not an escort that could outperform them at every turn. Reports from the front spoke of missions where half of the intercepting force was destroyed before they even reached the bombers. Returning pilots described feeling hunted, not as warriors but as prey. The Mustang was more than a fighter, it was a phantom that turned every mission into a test of survival. The psychological toll was so heavy that Japanese planners struggled to maintain a functioning air defense. When pilots no longer believed in victory, the entire system of defense began to collapse. Aircraft were left grounded for lack of willing men to fly them, and hastily trained teenagers, some barely able to handle the controls, were thrown into combat against Mustang veterans. For many of these boys, the encounter ended within minutes, their lives cut short in the burning wreckage of obsolete machines. The terror extended beyond the pilots. On the ground, civilians in Tokyo came to recognize the Mustangs as heralds of disaster. Whenever the silver fighters appeared in the skies, it meant the bombers were close behind. To the people below, the Mustang was a symbol of inescapable destruction, a reminder that the enemy could strike at will. American pilots, for their part, understood the psychological advantage they held. Mustang squadrons often deliberately circled above Japanese bases, waiting for defenders to scramble, then diving down in coordinated attacks. This show of dominance shattered whatever confidence the Japanese still possessed. By making the skies feel permanently unsafe, the Americans ensured that fear did as much damage as bullets. Over time, the Mustang became less a plane and more a legend. Stories circulated among Japanese pilots of squadrons wiped out by a handful of P-51s, of escorts that seemed to appear from nowhere, of missions where not a single man returned. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales spread like wildfire, feeding a culture of dread that no commander could erase. In war, numbers and machines are critical, but morale is often the deciding factor. By 1945, the P-51 Mustang had achieved something no weapon had managed before: it broke the spirit of Japan's Air Force. Once proud aviators, heirs to a tradition of daring and sacrifice, now faced the skies with trembling hands. And every time the Mustang silhouette appeared against the sun, that fear grew deeper, reminding them that no matter how hard they fought, the outcome had already been decided. By early 1945, the combined presence of B-29 bombers and their Mustang escorts transformed the skies over Japan into a battlefield of desperation. What had once been a contest between defenders and attackers was now something else entirely, a relentless campaign of destruction, in which the defenders stood little chance. The P-51 Mustang gave American commanders the confidence to expand bombing operations on a scale never before attempted. No longer forced to worry about staggering losses from unescorted missions, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched massive daylight raids against Japan's industrial heartlands. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, all were hammered repeatedly, with the Mustang sweeping the skies clear of opposition. For Japanese pilots, this period marked the breaking point. With every mission, more of their dwindling numbers were cut down. Once, they had relied on the tactics of massed attacks, overwhelming bombers with swarms of fighters. But the Mustang shredded those formations before they could close in. Attempts at surprise ambushes were equally futile. The American escorts flew higher, faster, and longer, ensuring no safe avenue of attack remained. The turning point was not just tactical but strategic. Japan's Air Force had been designed to defend its territory with the expectation that reinforcements, fuel, and experienced men could sustain it. By 1945, none of those assumptions held true. Fuel shortages crippled training, factories struggled under the rain of bombs, and losses of veteran pilots left cockpits filled with barely trained youths. Against the Mustang, these rookies had no chance. The impact rippled through every layer of Japan's defense. Without effective air cover, entire cities became vulnerable to devastating firebombing campaigns. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo killed tens of thousands and left much of the capital in ruins. While the B-29s delivered the destruction, it was the Mustangs that ensured they could do so with near impunity. Japanese commanders recognized the crisis but were powerless to change it. The technological and industrial gap was too wide. In meetings, some officers admitted bluntly that their air force could no longer guarantee the defense of the homeland. The Mustang had stripped away the last illusion of control. Meanwhile, for American pilots, the skies became a theater of dominance. The Mustang's reputation as the ultimate escort spread quickly among bomber crews, who now referred to the fighters as their guardian angels. With Mustang squadrons at their side, bomber losses dropped dramatically, while Japanese resistance collapsed further with each raid. The turning point of the air war over Japan was not a single battle but a process, a steady, merciless erosion of Japan's capacity to fight in the sky. The Mustang, with its range, speed, and firepower, was at the heart of this transformation. What began as a series of terrifying encounters became a systematic dismantling of Japan's air defenses. By the spring of 1945, Japanese pilots understood what their commanders already knew: the war in the air was lost. The P-51 Mustang had not only secured the skies, it had shattered Japan's last hope of turning the tide. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its industries broken, and its once proud air force reduced to a shadow of what it had been. Among the many symbols of American dominance, one stood out in the memories of Japanese pilots: the P-51 Mustang. For those who survived, the Mustang became an enduring image of inevitability. It was not only the weapon that guarded the bombers but also the harbinger of defeat. In post-war interviews, some Japanese veterans admitted that they had come to dread even the sound of its engine, a low growl that meant death was near. Others described it as a machine that stripped away hope, forcing them to fight not for victory but for honor alone. On the American side, the Mustang was celebrated as one of the finest fighters ever built. It was credited with turning the tide of the air war in both Europe and the Pacific, escorting bombers to targets once thought unreachable. Its sleek frame and long-range capability became the standard by which all fighters were judged in the years that followed. The Mustang's legacy in Japan extended beyond the battlefield. For civilians, it was a reminder of how vulnerable their homeland had become. To see Mustang circling freely above Tokyo was to realize that the nation's defenses had collapsed, and that surrender was no longer a question of if but when. The aircraft became part of the collective memory of defeat, an emblem of the overwhelming industrial and technological power that America brought to the war. In the decades after the conflict, aviation historians continued to debate the exact role the Mustang played in ending Japan's resistance. Some argue that strategic bombing and the atomic bomb overshadowed its impact. But among those who fought in the air, there was little doubt: the Mustang was the symbol of American air supremacy, the aircraft that broke the back of Japan's fighter force. Even today, the P-51 Mustang is remembered not only as a machine of war but as a legend. For Japanese veterans, it was the enemy they could never overcome. For Americans, it was the angel that guarded the skies. And in the history of the Pacific War, it remains the fighter that brought terror to Tokyo, and sealed the fate of an empire. The story of the P-51 Mustang over Tokyo is more than the tale of a single aircraft. It is the story of how technology, strategy, and timing combined to break an enemy's will. For Japanese pilots, the Mustang was not just an opponent in the sky, it was the embodiment of defeat, a constant reminder that the war could no longer be won. For the Americans, the Mustang became a legend, proof that innovation and persistence could turn the tide of battle. It gave bomber crews hope. It gave commanders confidence, and it delivered a crushing blow to Japan's last line of defense. In the end, the Mustang was not simply a fighter. It was a shadow cast across the Pacific, a flying symbol of inevitability. And when it appeared in the skies over Tokyo, it carried with it a message the empire could no longer ignore: the war was lost.